Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to this, a very special show, a joint event that we're holding with the Foreign Press Association of New York and with our special guest, Kenneth Roth. My name's Mark Seddon. I used to work for the United Nations. I used to be a speechwriter for Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and previously I've been a correspondent for Al Jazeera Television. And I'm joined by Ian Williams, the president of the Foreign Press Association of New York, a columnist, author, academic, and of course, Kenneth Roth, the man of the moment from human rights. Well, recently stood down as executive director of Human Rights Watch. And of course, Ken and his team over the years have been tirelessly exposing human rights abuses wherever they occur in the world, from China to Russia, wherever they may be, Israel, of course, Hamas, is an extraordinary spotlight trained daily on human rights abusers wherever they are active. And of course, in recent days, we've seen even more of Kenneth than usual, because what looked like a kind of slam dunk fellowship that he was offered at Harvard at the Kennedy Business School was mysteriously, well, not mysteriously at all, as Kenneth will tell us, but was suddenly withdrawn by the dean, and it would appear that actually there's been the real reason for this is a fear that donors may take their money elsewhere, and pressure put upon Ken, essentially claiming that Ken has been far too critical of Israeli human rights abuses. Well, we all know the truth of all of this. Throughout the past 10, 20 years, the laser light of Human Rights Watch has been focused, as we said, on countries and human rights abusers all over the world. And interestingly, just today, I think it's called the Harvard Crimson, the magazine of the Harvard University, reports that hundreds of affiliates, 360 affiliates to be precise, have actually written demanding that the dean of the Kennedy School, who rescinded the invitation for Kenneth to become a fellow, should actually resign. So this is kind of a moving story. It's breaking news, actually, in many respects. We wish Kenneth, of course, all the best, and because not only for what he stands for and what universities should stand for, freedom of speech, academic rigor, really the strength to say to donors, sorry, you don't tell us who we have as fellows, who we employ as academics. This is very important, not just for Harvard University, but for academic institutions all around the world. So thank you very, very much indeed, Kenneth, for joining us. I'm actually going to begin by asking Ian, as from the Foreign Press Association, chair of the Foreign Press Association of New York, to begin and ask Ken the first question. By the way, before we do, what we're going to say is, please send in your questions. We'll try and get them to Ken. We want to get in as many questions as we can. But as I say, I'd like to just begin by asking Ian to kick it off, if you will, Ian, and put the first question to Ken.
Well, it's good to see you, Ken. And as we were just reminded, I mean, this is 30 years of talking about human rights. And I have to say, it's included the Balkans, it's included Russia, it's included Guantanamo and Iraq, and without fear or favor across the board, because we have supported human rights, not individual countries, which is a distance that some people find too far something a leap too far for some people. But in this particular case, I mean, all of us who've been involved in human rights issues and in journalism know that the question of Israel has been it's more than the third rail. That's only 600 volts. It's the 25,000 volt overhead cable in the US, and we have seen now in Britain, where there's nothing like an accusation of anti-Semitism to shut people down, because if you deny it, you sort of reinforce the charge. It's like out of Monty Python. You've been wrestling with this for many years at Human Rights Watch, I know, and you must have taken a lot of tightrope walking with the donors. But in this case, could you let us know what the type of pressures that donors put on you about your selection of targets, or whether it's the old red diaper babies with threatening to withdraw checks if you criticize Putin too much, or in this case, of course, where the criticism of Israel will get the checkbooks locked up.
Yeah. I mean, Ian, this may surprise you, but I got very little donor pressure to, restrain Human Rights Watch from criticizing a particular government. And it's not that there are people out there who wouldn't have liked to do that. Of course there are. But it's just so clear that that won't work, that the people who, prioritize the protection of country X just don't give to Human Rights Watch. I just have always accepted that, these donors are not going to be contributors to Human Rights Watch. That's just the cost of upholding principle. We don't exempt countries. I mean, as both you and Mark have said, we're very much an equal opportunity critic. We work regularly in 100 countries around the world. In a conflict situation like the Israel-Palestine situation, we report on all sides. So, we report on Israeli, Palestinian Authority, Hamas, Hezbollah abuses. That's just what we do. And, every once in a while, there would be an existing donor to Human Rights Watch who was unhappy with the approach that we took to a particular country, usually Israel. So we would lose them, but that was pretty rare. Mainly it was a matter of just never getting the donor in the first place, when whatever, But, one thing I was just crystal clear about is that we were not going to compromise the core principles. That's Human Rights Watch needs its credibility as an impartial critic wherever the most serious violations occur. So, principle number one is we are fact-based. We try as objectively and partially as we can to find the facts. And principle two is we apply international human rights and humanitarian law to those facts and render the verdict as the facts dictate. That's what we do. We don't deviate from that. And so I didn't spend a lot of time resisting donor pressure because it was just a futile effort. People knew that. If they were going to give to Human Rights Watch, they were endorsing the principles. If they didn't like the principles, they didn't give to Human Rights Watch, and that's fine.
Yeah, Ken, I mean, for people watching who may not have been following all of the events, we are talking about a situation at Harvard University, the richest university in the world. I mean, it has budgets of a princely state.
More than princely.
People would be fascinated to know, I think, what exactly happened, because you were offered the deanship. Everybody expected it to happen. It would be a logical thing, really, for the Kennedy School to be offering you this, especially with the human rights portfolio. And yet you had an interview with the school's dean, Douglas Elmendorf, and I gather that he asked you if you had any enemies, which is a question that would slightly alarm me if I was asked that, because I had to spend half an hour trying to remember who they all are. But
well, I mean, Mark, let me fill you in on. Let me fill everybody in on the background. I think most people know it at this stage, but in essence, I announced my resignation from Human Rights Watch in April to take place at the end of August. And very quickly, the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, which is one part of the Harvard Kennedy School, called me up and said, would I be interested in principle in a fellowship to be a senior fellow at the Kennedy School? And I had been involved with the Carr Center informally for years. I actually held a big debate there, many, many years ago. And, I admired it. My plans during this current year were and are to write a book. And it seemed like a good place to do that because I would have colleagues to, kick ideas around, to read chapters. And so we kind of talked it over for about a month and I said, yes. So they said, look, the only, formality is to get the dean's approval, but it's an utter formality. This is not a big deal. And so that was that. And indeed, it was so assumed that I would get it that I actually reached out to the dean, not for an interview. I didn't think that was what was going on. I reached out to introduce myself, to say I'm going to be there in September. It'd be good if we got to know each other. And so we had a half-hour video chat in July. And it was a perfectly pleasant chat. It was really kind of normal. It just got weird at the end when he asked this question that you mentioned, Mark. Did I have any enemies? Now, this is such an odd question to ask me. I mean, I have so many enemies. That's what you do when you had a human rights organization. You criticize governments, they don't like it, you turn into their enemy. And so it's just, that's a hazard of the trade. You just totally accept it. So I kind of, laughed at him a bit. And I said, look, I have a lot of enemies. And I named in particular the Russian and the Chinese government because they both personally sanctioned me. I mentioned the Rwandan and the Saudi governments as two that particularly hate me. But then, I had an inkling what he was driving at. So I said, and I'm pretty sure the Israeli government doesn't like me too. And that turned out to be the kiss of death. So we didn't really discuss it much further. He mentioned, I'm trying to, exert more control over these fellowships, kind of a perfunctory statement. But that was it. I didn't think anything further of it other than it was a weird question. But 2 weeks later, the Carr Center calls me up and they were incredibly embarrassed. They said, the dean vetoed you because of your criticism of Israel. And I couldn't believe it. But that's what happened. Now, the big question is why? And this dean, Elmendorf, does not have any public record of a position on Israel-Palestine. If you Google him, it's this story that shows up, but nothing else. So I don't think it was personal animus, personal prejudice. I don't think that was the factor. And the only thing that anybody has been able to think of that's a plausible explanation is donor influence. Now, we do know, and Michael Massing in his excellent expose in The Nation went into this in depth, there are a number of big donors to the Kennedy School that are very pro-Israel. And indeed, the Kennedy School has a history of inviting senior Israeli officials, a retired Israeli general. They have a program where 10 Israeli officials show up every single year on a fully paid fellowship. So there's a lot of money behind the Kennedy School that is pro-Israel. What we don't know is, how was that influence exerted? Did Elmendorf call up certain donors and ask them their view? Did he just anticipate what their views were? We don't know. And Elmendorf isn't talking. His spokesperson has said, well, we don't dispute any of the specific allegations, whatever that means. Everybody's accusing that this, saying that this is donor driven. Do they not dispute that? That seems to be what they're saying, but they're not explicit. But whatever happened, the perception is now out there that donors drove what basically is a violation of academic freedom. That they were willing to say that we are not going to allow a fellow who has a history of criticizing Israel. And it's worth noting here, that, Human Rights Watch's criticism of Israel is pretty mainstream. Yes, we criticize Israel all the time because Israel deserves to be criticized, but we are hardly the most radical. Our rhetoric is very recent. It's very fact-based. We apply the law. So what they're basically saying is, in fact, that may be the problem. As I think about this more, I actually think that it's not that we're so partisan. It's that we're so impartial. And that it is the sting of an impartial group criticizing Israel that is much more deeply felt than criticisms coming from partisan opponents. And I actually think that's what's going on because, they've allowed, a handful of Palestinians to be at the Kennedy School. They've had people who are, not just pro-Israel, but I think it's exactly the respect that Human Rights Watch receives, I think justifiably, obviously, because of its impartiality, that people take our criticism seriously, and they didn't want me with that credibility having a Harvard Kennedy School credential. So I think that's what this is about. Now, the big issue is what's Harvard going to do? Because, right now, this sends a really bad message. And I should stress that, I'm not the primary victim here. I have other opportunities. This is not going to impede my future. I'll be fine. My concern is younger academics who are going to take a message from this episode and say, oh my goodness, if I criticize Israel, that could be a career-killing move. I could face retaliation. And that's a horrible message to send. So my question really is, partly to Dean Elmendorf of the Kennedy School, but really to the Harvard president, because this is the credibility of Harvard that's at stake. Do you stand for academic freedom? Or do you stand for donors who can influence the intellectual independence of your scholars? And I don't know the answer to that because Harvard isn't talking. But what I hope they do is to say, we get it. We messed up here. And we are going to clarify that, Harvard, the richest academic institution in the world, the institution that above anybody else could afford to be principled in defending academic freedom from donor influence. I would hope that Harvard says, we're going to do the right thing. And we're going to announce a policy. Donors are never allowed to interfere with academic freedom. Administrators like Doug Elmendorf are never allowed to anticipate donor objections to interfere with academic freedom. We value the independence of our scholars above all else. That's what I'd like to see. So far, Harvard isn't talking.
Ian.
There is, well, it's not just academia. We have to be concerned about reporters as well. As you know, there was a junior reporter from AP who was fired 6 months ago because previously she had tweets that were taken as pro-Palestinian. And it's exactly the same thing. It's the third rail or the overhead wire. But the other phenomenon you mentioned is the credibility of organizations like Human Rights Watch, because the fight back is interesting because they're setting up their own NGOs. I mean, I think you mentioned them in your Guardian piece, the NGO Monitor and UN Watch, which I've been following since they were set up. And as far as I know, they've never concerned themselves about the UN except in the Middle Eastern context. The only NGOs that they monitor are on there. So they're so obviously partisan, but the media always quote them as though they have the same sort of independence and magisterial prestige as Human Rights Watch or Amnesty. And in that sense, the media is making a rod for their own backs because these people are obviously wherever you are, paid shills for the government of Israel and its supporters.
Yeah, no, Ian, you're absolutely right. In others, I mean, there's this cottage industry of small NGOs. They always have neutral names to, it's not like they say, we're the Israeli Partisan Association. They have completely neutral names to cover up what they're really doing. But, in their view, never in the history of the world has the Israeli government committed a human rights violation. And they devote, all of their time or the vast majority of their time to criticizing anybody who criticizes Israel. And what makes this particularly rich is that they accuse people of bias. It's hard to imagine, a more biased set of people than the partisans who spend day and night defending the Israeli government and say it never does anything wrong. And they have the audacity to accuse other people of bias. So, yes, this I think is, in a sense, it's an indictment of journalism, which feels that, there has to be both sides to everything. And so you're always going to find somebody to represent the other side. I think most journalists know not to take these groups seriously, but they feel obliged to at least represent the other side through their spokespeople.
Mm-hmm. Ken, we're getting quite a lot of questions coming in, which is fantastic. And by the way, I should say that Ken has joined us from Geneva, and Ian has joined us from New York today. But if I may, Ken, I'm going to fire two or three at you. The first is actually is Kira. Kira says, "Hello everybody. Imagine being fired for doing your job thoroughly and competently." Jane in New York asks, "Does Kenneth feel Harvard may U-turn on this decision in light of the massive outrage about his fellowship being rescinded?" Jane Elliott says, "All due respect to Human Rights Watch and Mr. Roth." Second question, Miriam in Cambridge, Massachusetts asks, "How much of this does Kenneth think is down to Human Rights Watch's 2021 report exposing Israel as practicing the crime of apartheid? Does Kenneth think this is what is angering and scaring Israel's allies the most?" So a couple of questions there for you, Ken.
Okay. Yeah, well, first, do I think Harvard is going to do a U-turn? For the sake of academic freedom, I hope they do a U-turn. And at this point, I mean, it's not about my fellowship, the year's half done. I mean, if they turned around and offered it back to me tomorrow, I'd feel obliged to accept it and spend some time there. But, at this stage, it's really about the broader principle. But that broader principle is important because if they just stand where they are with their head in the sand and reaffirm their decision, that does send this signal to academics that, you're in trouble if you criticize Israel. And we really don't want that signal sent. Now, the apartheid report, almost 2 years ago, I guess April 2021, Human Rights Watch issued a report finding that the Israeli government is responsible for the crime against humanity of apartheid. And it was a very carefully researched report. It was more than 200 pages of incredibly detailed facts that made a devastating case. And then the legal analysis, this was not, we were explicit, it was not meant as historical analogy to South Africa. We applied international human rights law. There are two treaties that define what apartheid is. One is the Convention Against Apartheid. The other is the Rome Statute to the International Criminal Court. And so we took this legal definition and said, you match the facts with the law, and frankly, there's no question. This is apartheid. And we were not the only ones. In fact, the B'Tselem, the very respected Israeli group, about 6 months before us came out, or I guess 4 months before us, came out with actually a tougher finding than we did. And Amnesty a few months later came out with a very similar finding. Various Palestinian groups have had this. And so, I mean, at this stage, I think it's fair to say that the recognition that the Israeli government is committing the crime of apartheid has become the mainstream understanding within the human rights community. I actually don't know any serious human rights activist who's involved in this issue who doesn't believe that. And I think what brought us all to this recognition is that for many years the oppressive discrimination was present in the occupied territories, but the answer to it was, oh, this is just temporary. Don't worry. There's a peace process. Once we have peace, it'll all go away. But, more than half a century later, the peace process is dead. I mean, it's going nowhere. This new government has zero inclination to do anything pursuant to the peace process. And so we all kind of came to the recognition that this wasn't temporary. This is just reality. This is what life is like. And we have to recognize that and call it by its name. This is not a temporary, soon be gone factor of the occupation. This is permanent apartheid rule. So we've all kind of came to that decision. Now, was that the key for Harvard? I mean, again, I don't know. They didn't specify. They talked about criticism of Israel. They talked about bias. They didn't get into details. The Israeli government certainly is not happy about the apartheid designation, although I should say that when Human Rights Watch issued its report, the Israeli government couldn't find anything wrong. They couldn't find any facts wrong. They couldn't find anything wrong with the legal analysis. They resorted to kind of the usual name calling, but I took that as a sign of victory. We were pretty careful with this. But I think it's, I actually think it's more than that. I mean, I think that it is precisely the fact that Human Rights Watch is so respected as an impartial observer of the Israeli-Palestinian situation that makes our commentary so difficult for supporters of the Israeli government to accept. And I suppose I should take this as a badge of honor, but there are bigger principles at stake, which is academic freedom. So I'm not settling for the statement from Harvard on our reporting. I would like them to do the right thing.
Ian.
Well, it just struck me as the old one of Napoleon's marshals, when he executed the wrong person, said that this is worse than a crime. It's a blunder. And I'm wondering if Harvard and the Israeli supporters haven't done the same thing there, because they've raised such an excreta storm in opposition that Israeli human rights practices are getting far more publicity than they would do otherwise, and right across academia and the media. So they have brought the issue to the forefront. When if they'd been cleverer, better practitioners of what they call hasbara, they would have just kept quiet and hoped to go away and said it was just those people again. But by creating this storm, they going to create a reaction amongst many people, because it seems that now Israel and its supporters are against not just human rights watch, but explicitly against human rights. Because as you say, their silence on the actual issues is, well, very eloquent.
Yeah. Ian, I think you're right. This was a huge blunder on Harvard's part. My counterpart at Amnesty International, Salil Shetty, the two prior Secretary General, has been a senior fellow. I mean, he's not there currently, but he was there until quite recently for several years. Nobody noticed. It was no big deal. And if Elmendorf, the dean, had simply let me do that, I suspect that it would have been the same thing in my case. But either because he asked donors or because he was fearful of donor reaction, he did the wrong thing. And now it is completely backfired. And you're absolutely right. There's much more attention to not only the issue of academic freedom, but also Israeli human rights violations than there would have been if they just let me show up and work on my book at Harvard.
Well, Ken, I mean, I was looking at this Harvard Crimson, which is a great magazine of repute and accuracy. And essentially, last year, it was reporting that Harvard apparently invests around $200 million in companies that the United Nations has listed as being tied to Israeli settlements in the occupied territories. So in a way, what you've just been saying there actually could be even more counterproductive for Harvard, because there's going to be even more focus on where Harvard has been investing money and where the money is coming from. But I just wondered if I might bring in a couple more questions from our audience. Ahmed in Nottingham in England asks, in a way, is Ken's experience an extension of anti-Palestinian racism, where Palestinians and advocates and now even human rights campaigners can't even speak truthfully about their lived experience or the situation on the ground without facing a backlash? I wonder how many thousands of Palestinians have lost jobs for just being Palestinian and talking about their oppression. Probably more a comment than a question. Here is Robbie Roy. I'm not sure where Robbie is coming from, where he's living, but Robbie says, how long does Ken think this pressure from Israel supporters will work, as in his case and in others? Who will force them to stop? And one more, well, actually, Sam Bahur says, thank you, Ken, from Palestine. Your integrity stands above them all. Now, Abigail Absilla Metza, she says, the New York Times hasn't yet reported on this, although the Washington Post has. I don't know. Is that the case, Ken? Do you know if the New York Times has been reporting on this?
The New York Times is on the case, so I anticipate they will write soon. And I haven't seen the Washington Post. I don't know if they just ran the Wire story or what. I haven't been contacted yet by a Washington Post journalist. So they may have just run a Wire story. I mean, the question, how long will Israeli supporters go after this? I mean, look at my Twitter feed. I mean, it's just, they're endless. They just go on and on and on. And it's, it's all the same things. I'm biased, I'm anti-Semitic, I had Jew hatred, it's, and, they kind of run out of things to say. And so I doubt they're going to stop, because the raison d'etre of these little partisan groups is to keep doing what they're doing. And I've been their number one target for years now, because I had Human Rights Watch. So I'm no longer at Human Rights Watch, but I still matter to them because I still have a certain voice. I think they particularly hate my my Twitter feed. So I'm not surprised that they're going to keep at it. And I think that they, probably deep down, they realize that this was a huge blunder, as Ian says, and just, realize they're losing this particular battle pretty severely. But that doesn't mean they're going to just, call it quits. They keep coming after me.
Ian.
Well, I'm thinking, the point about Israel and its supporters is there is a central direction, and they do direct it. The government has a Hasbara department, and your Twitter feed sounds like a compressed version of one of the speeches of the recent permanent representative of Israel to the United Nations. He comes out with your Twitter feed from the station, I think, or from your opponent's Twitter feed from the platform. But it's very much, there are grassroots Israeli supporters across the US who are, well, almost rabid. They really do not believe that it's possible to criticize Israel. It's a quasi-religious aspect. So no matter what you do, we're never going to persuade these people. It's the sensible people who shouldn't be listening to them in academia, in newspaper publishing as well, because it is, as any reporter who's covered the area knows, very, very difficult to get critical or objective reporting across. The very first piece I did from Israel for The Guardian, it went through about 6 different stages. And they told me that I'd been reported for anti-Semitism because I said I was bitten by a mosquito in Jerusalem. They get pretty desperate. You know, they're told to criticize, but they don't know what to criticize when they look at it. So it is a very sensitive subject, but any of us who, if we go along with it, then we're making it more difficult for your successors at Human Rights Watch or Amnesty or any of the other, the CPJ, for example, to complain about the next Palestinian journalist to be shot in the head, because Israel doesn't do that. So how can you say that? I'm really pleased that you stood up and put out in some detail the history of this. And it would be very interesting to see if Harvard actually has, unless it's degenerated through millennia of evolution and lost its spine completely, whether it's going to stand up on this and actually even give its excuses, no matter how pathetic they are, because otherwise they really stand condemned in the world of academia and politics and human rights.
Yeah. Ian, look, let me make 2 points. I mean, one is that, Harvard should be capable of exerting leadership here. And, of course, at this stage, now that it's all public, there will be criticism from Israeli partisans. They've got to be grown-ups about this and learn to take that heat, I mean, if not, they're in the wrong business, because leadership at Harvard should be able to say, these are the principles of academic freedom. We don't necessarily endorse the view of every scholar, but they have a right to say what they want on the Israeli issue. And we are not going to penalize people or not hire people because they've taken, a strong factual stand on what's going on there. So that's what leadership is about. And if, their fear of the partisan criticism is what's driving this, I mean, that's just ridiculous. I do think it's, less that than particular donors, but we don't know for sure because Elmendorf still has his head in the sand and is not telling us. So the anti-Semitism charge, let me pick that up, because I do think that scares a lot of people from criticizing the Israeli government's conduct. And I think part of why I really drive the Israeli partisans crazy is because I'm Jewish. And it's just harder to credibly get away with calling me anti-Semitic. There was, one critic today who said, well, I'm only thinly Jewish, whatever that means, It's like, my father was Jewish.
You've got to put some more weight on, Ken. You need
right,
to
there you go. Yes, right. Really? Maybe that's the reference. I got to put on a few pounds. Yes, right. But, it's my thin Jewish roots, I think is what they said, But, that's, but it sort of shows that they want to use that anti-Semitism slur. It just is not going to work with me, and it's driving them crazy. So,
Ken, I wonder if I can come in there, because next week I'm going to be interviewing Kenneth Stern, and Kenneth, as you know, is the author of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which has been adopted by many universities in this country, also other institutions and political parties. And he, I know, because he's written about it, and obviously he's agreed to come to be interviewed about it, has been extremely concerned that this definition could be abused in this way to essentially silence critics of Israeli apartheid policies or Israeli human rights abuses. So what would you say to those people who have looked at this IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and have been trying to use this? in the way that Kenneth Stern and many, many others were afraid of.
Yeah, I think that's a big problem. And, of course, there was an alternative definition of anti-Semitism. I think it was called the Jerusalem Declaration or something like that, which is much more carefully drafted. But the IHRA definition has been, you could say distorted or at least used to essentially turn critics of Israeli government policy and conduct into supposed anti-Semites. And I think it's just the sloppiness of the language in the IHR definition, or its openness to interpretation. But, if you take a group like Human Rights Watch, which, the main way we function is by criticizing governments. The entire premise of the human rights movement is you investigate, you expose, you shame governments, and thereby pressure them to change. So it's all about criticizing governments. If that, in the case of Israel, somehow becomes anti-Semitism, one is just preposterous, but there's something more serious here. Because if people begin to think that the very important concept of anti-Semitism, an ongoing, vibrant threat, if that is being cheapened to mean just criticism of Israel, people are going to start taking it less seriously. And that's a problem for the serious problem of anti-Semitism. So there is this short-term use of the anti-Semitism slur to try to silence criticism of Israel, with a real long-term consequence for the Jewish people who continue to suffer the consequences of anti-Semitism.
Ian.
Well, as I understand it, with the definition, the Holocaust commemoration definition was the examples that were added afterwards, after Stern and the main draft was there. Somebody probably innocently added a list of examples. They were told, produce some examples. And these are the ones that have been expanded to basically to include any criticism of Israel. And of course, there's been a very heavy lobby to get it with the examples. They always say with the examples. And it's not so much, I should say, it's self-censorship. Because most of us in the human rights movement are still traumatized and appalled by the Holocaust and what happened in Nazi Germany on every level. And so this is very potent for inhibiting people's outspokenness on the issue. It's not just that you're scared of the personal consequences. It's like darkness at noon, where the Bolsheviks delivered themselves to be shot because they thought it was the right thing to do. So we keep ourselves inhibited, and because it's the last thing we'd want for our own consciences. It's like being accused of when did you stop beating your wife type of question. And none of us want anything. None of us want in any way to feel that, and it does take a lot of sort of mental strife to overcome this enough to criticize Israel. I certainly found that myself to begin with.
But see, Ian, that's part of why I feel a responsibility not to let myself be cowed by these critics. I think that I actually entered into the human rights movement precisely because of the Holocaust, because my father grew up in Nazi Germany and fled in July 1938 as a 12-year-old boy, came to New York. So I grew up with Hitler stories. And that was a big part of what pushed me into the human rights cause, because I wanted to avoid repetition of something like this. But, there do seem to be almost, two lessons taken from the Holocaust. One is just to be tougher than the next guy and, be indifferent to things like human rights that might constrain a tougher approach. The other, which is what I subscribe to, is we need to reinforce the basic norms of decency that the human rights cause represents, so we don't get a repetition of these kinds of atrocities. But there is a real split in the lessons to be drawn from the Holocaust. And I think we see that in those who are defending Israel, regardless of what it does, versus those who try to hold Israel to the same standards as everybody else.
Ken, we are beginning to sort of run out of time, unfortunately, but I've got a couple more questions to put to you from our audience. Farouk in London asks, can Kenneth Roth explain how Israel is not only committing the crime of apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territories, but also against Palestinians inside Israel itself? Robbie Roy, I'm not really sure where Robbie is getting in touch from, but Robbie says, Gideon Levy said to my surprise, most Israelis don't even pay attention to the abuse of the Palestinians. Do you agree with that? And Here we have a couple of other comments. Shahad Abu Salama says, power to Ken for standing up for academic freedom and the truth. I hope all these damning reports of Israel's apartheid against the Palestinians bring us closer to justice. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Roth, for your courage. Much respect. Thanks for coming on this evening. Thanks very much for coming on this evening. Anyway, just a couple of last questions there, and then I'll come to Ian for any final question. But over to you, Ken.
I mean, Gideon Levy's observation, I think, is sadly true. You know, that many Israelis don't go to the West Bank. They certainly don't go to Gaza. They don't really encounter the problems there. They live their own life. You know, they avoid the newspaper accounts of it. So I think it is quite possible to live in Israel and just not have this be a big factor on your consciousness, which is what makes it easier to persist. I think if every Israeli had to spend a little time in Gaza, or even a little time in Jenin, their feeling would be different. Now, the apartheid question, it's probably too complicated for the 4 minutes we have left here, but let me just say that there are slight differences of opinion among the different human rights groups about the exact locale of apartheid. To give you kind of a very simplistic understanding of Human Rights Watch's take on this, there are 3 elements of the crime. We found the elements of those crimes, the crime came together within the occupied territories. So we were not opining on the state of things within Green Line Israel, where there clearly is systematic discrimination. But there are others who have found that to be apartheid within Green Line Israel, and probably they're the best ones to ask that question. Was there something else I'm trying to remember?
No, I think that covers it. And I'll just throw back to Ian for your last question, Ian, if you will.
Well, all of these things come together. There's a cycle on it. I was appalled, was it last week or the week before, when so-called democracies voted against referring Israeli practices to the International Court of Justice. And, it raises the question, first of all, what are they scared of? They know the answer is going to come. They know that, not because the ICJ is biased, because as Human Rights Watch has detailed, the facts are there on the ground. But countries like Britain and Canada and Australia that purport to stand up for democracy either voted against or abstained. And this practice is getting more prevalent across Western Europe, which makes it even more important that organizations like Human Rights Watch have an uninhibited say on it to shame the Western governments that are expedient supporters of human rights, including, of course, Britain, Australia, Germany. It is appalling when you study their voting record on these issues, when they're expecting people to stand against Vladimir Putin for annexing territories and terrorizing the inhabitants, why other countries shouldn't be held to similar standards.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a lot of talk these days that, when China or Russia are being discussed, of the need to respect the rules-based order. But obviously, an essential element of the rules-based order is international human rights law. But those same governments that are pushing the rules-based order for China or Russia don't talk about those rules when it comes to Israel. They don't want an International Court of Justice ruling, defining how those rules apply in the Israeli context. And of course, the other big question, because the International Court of Justice would be a civil proceeding. It would basically be an advisory opinion from the court. But there also is a potential criminal case in the offing by the International Criminal Court, a separate institution, which has jurisdiction because Palestine has joined the court. There is a formal investigation that has been opened. There actually is a pretty easy case to be made, toward Hamas for the indiscriminate rocket attacks in Israel, and for the Israeli government for the building of the settlements, which are a clear violation of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention and a war crime. So this is not a difficult case to make. The question is, does Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor of the ICC, does he have the backbone to do the right thing and to pursue this case? So this is a big open question.
It is indeed, Ken. And this great push for consistency across international law and human rights is actually one of the most powerful arguments that can be deployed and is being deployed, it seems to me. It does require such a fantastic degree of consistency because, for instance, we know just in passing that the United States has accepted that Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara is acceptable. I know this is an issue close to Ian's heart, but absolutely. And look, Ken, thank you very, very much. And thank you also, Ian. Ken, we wish you all the very best. We're going to be watching very closely what's happening over the next few days. We hope justice will prevail, and we hope to see you take that fellowship at Harvard with a full explanation as to why that absurd decision was taken by the university. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you to all of you and I'm so sorry we couldn't get through all of your questions. So sorry, because we had so many of you wanting to get in touch and ask those questions. But thank you once again to Ken in Geneva, Ian in New York. And until next time, it's goodbye.